What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota, Danny Abdeljabbar. Danny, you have a Brittany update, don't you?
Yeah, man. I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Welcome to Brittany Watch.
This is Brittany.
This is Brittany Watch.
Everybody. I'm very proud to announce that James Spears, the father who's been the conservator of Britney Spears for the last 13 years, is finally stepping down, which is awesome. Huge, major victory. By the way, I was reading an article on Variety.com. Don't go to Variety.com. It literally made me wait 15 seconds before it goes to the article, and it just showed me the shittiest ad. It was just like big blank white page and a little tiny little ad, and I'm like, I have to stare at this one tiny little ad for 15 seconds. Fuck you, Variety. Anyway, back to the point. She's finally, I think, her way. This is really awesome. The fact that he's leaving. I mean, he was, by Britney's own admission, the reason why she doesn't want to be in a conservatorship. Like, maybe she'd still be in it if he wasn't the conservator. But good for her. Congratulations. I don't know if we know any information about who might take over the conservatorship, because that's not over yet. But obviously, her legal team is going to push to end it at this point. So the cards are falling. It's kind of like, the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan. It's only a matter of time before, before somebody else takes over. So
what if she does murder somebody afterwards?
Well, I mean, really, I don't think that has anything to do with the conservatorship.
What if? What if we?
I don't think that has anything to do with.
I'm joking. I know that doesn't have.
No, I know. I'm also kind of playing along with this though. If she does go and murder someone, that's just because she murdered somebody, and I think the prime target would probably be her father.
Yeah, it's not like the conservatorship. It prevents her from murdering people, right?
Exactly. So she can murder somebody if she wants to murder someone. So
should have had that conservatorship.
Those two things wouldn't be related.
It just controls her money and prevents. Well,
exactly.
Weird stuff though too. Like her personal relationships are affected by that, right? Like she can't marry someone, or she can't
for sure.
date people.
And she does have some restricted access to movement, like free movement and shit like that. But generally speaking, she can still move around on her own. So there's nothing stopping her from
murdering. Okay, that's good.
Murdering someone. She could do that if she wanted to. The conservatorship isn't preventing her from doing such. That would be a wild turn of events. I hope it doesn't happen, obviously. But talk about wild, right? That would be 10 steps backwards.
That would be a very, very an M. Night Shyamalan twist. Or no,
I know it would
Shyamalan
read like
twist.
that. Yeah,
it would be a very a climax to the story, right? Like she comes,
it'd be nuts.
To her father's bedside and starts. Burns him alive in it, light the fire, the bed and burn.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about inflation.
All right.
Good segue, right? So, all right. So inflation to me is you're a Game of Thrones fan, so you'll get this, and I'm assuming 50% of the people who listen to this are at least familiar with Game of Thrones or have watched some episodes. But you know how in the earlier seasons and the later seasons as well, you'll have episodes where there's all this political squabbling and all these power politics going on, and then meanwhile it will cut to the White Walkers. And then you'll see the White Walkers are gaining power and they're about to approach the wall, and all is doomed. Right. That is how I feel about hyperinflation. This looming dark cloud over society, and who knows when it could happen, or it's almost like we're bound to hit that at some point, the way that our monetary system is conducted. I mean, how do you feel? Do you have that same fear?
Yeah, I could see what you're saying. We go from the beginning of the beginning of the series, and there's like 2 White Walkers, and then skip forward 7 seasons, and now there's like millions of them, right? So in that way, they're kind of hyperinflating on their own. But also, your comparison I think is pretty astute in the sense that everybody's like bitching and moaning about who gets the throne when no one's paying attention to the fact that there's a bunch of like murderous zombie ice people that are gonna come and kill you,
aka the central bank being the ice people.
Murderous zombie ice people, the central bank. Yeah, no, it's not the central bank. It's the inflation that kills you, right? The central bank is kind of like let me try and see if I can draw. The central bank is like the Night King.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
They're the ones that create the White Walker.
Exactly.
Right? And so the central banks is the one that creates, hyperinflation.
Yeah.
Right?
The Night King is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So earlier in the month, there was a poll conducted by The Hill that found that 31% of voters named inflation as what concerns them most about the economy. And, there's a really good article from wolfstreet.com that tracks the current inflation right now. So the consumer price index rose 0.9% in June and 5.4% over the past 12 months. The largest jump for each since mid-2008, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics today.
All right, what does that even mean?
So the CPI measures the loss of purchasing power, thus the purchasing power of labor. So the loss of purchasing power is increasing.
Oh, so like the value of your money.
The value of your money is decreasing. Prices are going up. So rent of primary residence went up by 1.9% over the year. The cost of home ownership, so the amount of
rent is too damn high, right?
Well, the rent is going up. I mean, outside of New York City and major cities where people fled, other cities are having increases in rent. Like smaller cities are having their rents increasing because of the exodus from really large urban areas. But the cost of home ownership, so the amount of rent that would have to be paid in order to substitute a currently owned house as a rental property, that rose by 2.4% over the year. Energy costs spiked by 23.8% over the year. Durable goods inflation spiked by 14.3%. New vehicles has spiked by 6.4%. And then restaurant prices have jumped by 4.6%, the most since 2009. And I think with restaurants, that's just the beginning. I think restaurant prices are really going to jump pretty soon, just because of all the costs that restaurants are, they have to kind of absorb right now. They're eventually going to have to pass that on to the consumer, or the patron, with just the operating costs and all the COVID stuff and, just the price of their food. Their ingredients are going up. So, I think it would do us good to look at some examples of inflation in the most extreme form. We're being told right now that the current inflation is transitory, meaning temporary, but it certainly seems like it's going to be permanent. But let's talk about the most famous example. And I think this is probably the most famous example of hyperinflation ever, which is post-World War I Germany, the Weimar Republic. I think is probably the most famous, notorious case of hyperinflation throughout human history, along with Zimbabwe's. And, it's something I think that we should...
I think it's probably still worse than like places like Zimbabwe, to be honest.
Yeah,
I think it's still worse.
Well, let's jump into it, and I'm just going to lay out kind of like the basic background of this. In 1913, before World War I broke out, total currency in Germany amounted to 6 billion marks. So the mark was the gold standard base currency of the German Empire. Fast forward, November 1923 in Berlin, a loaf of bread cost 428 billion marks.
fucking wheelbarrows of money.
Wheelbarrows of money.
That's so much money.
420
Say that
billion
again. 428 billion marks.
428 billion marks. The prices were crazy. So the Reichsbank had issued 496.5 quintillion marks, each of which had fallen to 1/trillionth of its 1914 gold value. So practically every economic good and service was costing trillions of marks. The American dollar was quoted at 4.2 trillion marks, and the American penny at 42 billion marks. You studied the German language as well as German history in school, so talk about the imagery of the Weimar Republic during the early 1920s during this hyperinflationary period.
I mean, it wasn't great. I think that during the inflation period, right,
like
to
the wheelbarrows and the women.
Yeah, it was fucking bad, right? There was a lot of. I think the best way to talk about it is to talk about it through art, because I think it was really, really reflected, kind of the zeitgeist at the time, to borrow a German phrase there. There were painters and artists that were depicting life in Weimar Republic as utterly dismal. One of my favorites, and I'm trying to pull it up, Henry. You can look at this too. Otto Dix. He was a painter, and he did a particular painting. Yeah, it's called the Scat Players. If you want to Google that, that one's pretty crazy. And so the Scat Players is a painting by Otto Dix, and it depicts. I might have talked about this on the show a long time ago, but it depicts three World War I veterans at a table playing cards, and just by saying it that way is kind of an understatement. They are horribly mutilated, and they have a number of prostheses. I think when we talked about World War I, we talked about kind of the increase in medical technology, which kept people alive even after they had been maimed. So like this one guy's holding up his cards with his feet. Another guy's like missing the bottom part of his like jaw. Another guy's got a like crazy looking glass eye, and like he's holding the cards with his mouth. It's kind of a gruesome picture, but they're kind of just sitting along around the table getting along. And I think what this painting really kind of symbolized is kind of the gruesome picture of the post-war German society. It was maimed, but it was still trying to get along, right? And I think that's probably a good picture of it, right? During the hyperinflation period, we have abject poverty, abject homelessness, abject unemployment, just terrible situation. But either through pure will or I don't even know how to describe it. The German people kept chugging along, and doing their thing, but it wasn't easy, and it was a terrible time to live. I mean, again, when you had any amount of money, and suddenly let's say you had, you're very well to do, and you had 1 million marks in the beginning of, at the end of the First World War, and then inflation happens. 1 million marks doesn't mean shit when you need 428 billion of them to buy a loaf of bread.
They had to go to a barter
let that sit
system.
in for a moment.
A barter system.
Exactly. And they were trading interesting shit too. They were trading like fucking eggs. They were using eggs as currency. Eggs. Like they break and they go bad and shit, but like eggs was a very valuable commodity.
The egg would outlast the inflation.
Right, of course, because the value of an egg is an egg.
Yeah, the value of an egg, and even if it goes bad in a week or 2 weeks or whatever. I don't know how long eggs typically last. What, like 2-3 weeks?
I don't know. I eat them too fast.
Now,
I don't know how long they last.
It's interesting, like other stories you hear about, like factory workers. When they're paid, they'd have to give their money to their wives, and their wives would have to go to the factory and then go right to the store as soon as the worker
as soon as they
received
get the
payment,
money.
because the prices would be changing so quickly. So
Right.
you couldn't like hold on to it, because by the time you brought the money back home, the price would already change. So it was that type of environment.
Yeah, it was nuts. Absolutely nuts. But I think, to talk about this particular, time in German history, the Weimar Republic, you have to like set up, what happened in World War I, because it wasn't just like they, flipped a switch immediately and then suddenly it was crazy. There's a lot of things that happened along the way. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that.
So before World War I, as the war was about to break out, the German Empire was betting on getting a quick KO on France, given that they had embarrassed them in the Franco-Prussian War about 40 years prior. So the government thought they were going to be able to finance the war by issuing bonds. And then they were going to have the French, once defeated, redeem those bonds in gold. And it's important to note, the Germans did not impose an income tax to finance this war. Therefore, the war was financed completely by issuing debt. And since taxes are always unpopular, the German government preferred to borrow the needed amounts of money rather than raise taxes. So gold redemption, it was suspended. And these newly created loan banks were allowed to simply just create money. So basically, limitless fiat money was created by having the Reichsbank accept government security as security for loans to the government. What we call quantitative easing today. And quantitative easing is when the central bank purchases longer term securities from the open market in order to increase the money supply. In short, it just means creating money out of nothing. And I guess at the time, German government bills were so well regarded that they were considered risk-free. Well, that's not the way things turned out. Because by the end of the war, the amount of money in circulation in Germany had risen fourfold, and prices went up about 140%. So the Reich's debt...
So that inflation had already started towards the end of the war, right? It wasn't like it just suddenly happened right after the war. Obviously, it exacerbated, but it was already in play.
The inflation,
White Walkers were growing.
Yeah, the inflation had already started because of the monetary policies during World War I. So it didn't just happen after the war. It happened due to their central bank during the war to finance the war, because they weren't going to raise taxes. Morale was already really low in Germany. People were starving. It was there were blockades.
It was bad.
It was awful. So the last thing they were going to do was raise taxes. So they financed the war by debt, and that's why there was a huge price increase, 140% by the end of the war. But that's child's play to what happens a couple of years later. But I think it's important to note every major power's currency was suffering at the time. I think the German mark was around the same as the pound. I think it was even stronger than the franc, and the dollar was.
Yeah, it was doing pretty well against the dollar. It was doing pretty well against the dollar, though. I think it was like 1-4 or something like that.
Yeah, it was like 1-4 with the dollar, but they all the major powers' currencies were suffering. What Germany also had to deal with was being the loser of the war.
Yeah, or the official loser, that is.
The official loser of the war. The Treaty of Versailles, for those not familiar, the entire war was blamed on Germany. They were stripped of their colonies. The French straight up annexed Alsace-Lorraine, and Germany was required to pay for all the damages caused by the war in the form of reparations. France, in particular, demanded very heavy reparations because they were embittered by the amount of human life lost. Over 1.3 million French soldiers were killed during the war. which is just astonishing.
That's an insane amount of people.
I think about 1 million German soldiers were killed. I think 1.3 million French soldiers were killed. I'm not sure how many British soldiers were killed. I know it's very high. 100,000 American soldiers were killed. 500,000 or so Italian soldiers were killed. I'm not sure what the number is in the Austro-Hungarian Empire is, but I know it's high. Millions and millions of soldiers. But France and Russia, took the most.
They really got hit
Really hard. I mean, Russia, that's just kind of par for the course when it comes to war. They throw men in the meat grinders like no one else, but France was doing the same. I mean, all of them were doing that. But the French suffered 400,000 casualties alone in the Battle of Verdun.
Yeah, nuts.
Which was one of the largest battles in the entire war. 400,000 casualties. So 400,000 people removed from the battlefield from either dying or, some type of combat action that, took them away from the trenches. But it was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And then France, wanted its payments, but also wanted to keep the German economy weak in order to prevent them from remilitarizing. But in order to get payments, they needed Germany to have a strong economy. So you can kind of see the contradiction there.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg situation there.
But the fiscal situation was really bad at the end of the war. So before the war actually ends, and I know you're familiar with this part of the history, but Kaiser Wilhelm, the monarch of Germany, the guy with the gimpy arm, he is deposed by a workers' revolution, and then 2 days later, 2 days after he's deposed, that's when Germany signs. They've surrendered. The armistice is signed on November 11th of 1918, and the political party that wins the first election in the new Weimar Republic is the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and what the Weimar Republic becomes is a welfare state.
All right, well, hold on, because you can't just jump right into that welfare state bit, because the welfare state is a dirty word. Let me take this part. Let me start by talking generally about some positive and negative points about the Weimar Republic, just to get us
talk
primed
about
for
a little
this.
bit of good about them, a little bit of
good, a little bit of bad, Because admittedly, when I was doing the research on this, and obviously, as you pointed out, I studied German for a long time, especially in college, and I went to a very liberal university, so they painted an interesting picture there. Yeah, I went to Rutgers.
Rutgers is very liberal?
The German program in Rutgers is pretty liberal. I can say that.
I guess every university is.
With absolute.
Surprisingly, my school was not very liberal. Actually, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to class enough in college to know if they were super liberal or not. I wouldn't even known if I was there.
Well, so I didn't notice when I was in school, but look, in hindsight, I can see. And the reason why is because the way, and I am definitely, like some of my professors, if they're listening, they would probably be very upset with me for saying this, but if I'm to paint with a super broad brush, what I took away from a lot of the classes that, covered Weimar Republic was, you had the Prussian Empire, and they sucked, right? And they're an authoritarian, dictatorship, basically. And then we had this very short-lived republic that was, it had its problems, but, it was really positive in a lot of, ways. And if they just let it run out, then, it probably would have been awesome. But then the Nazis came and fucked it up, right? And that's, in a nutshell, kurz gesagt, as they would say, the kind of like influence that I got learning this. But after approaching it, kind of with your help and looking at, some of the more libertarian writings, reading some stuff that you sent me on Mises, and just watching the few videos of just economics that talked about the Weimar Republic, it definitely gave me a bit more context. So I do want to talk about like positive and negative things here. So I promise I'll try my best not to be too biased on this one, but let's talk about some good things, because I feel like, we started by, saying that, Weimar Republic is the shining example of hyperinflation, which is a terrible thing. But there were some really great things about the Weimar Republic too. So if the things that weren't even available in most Western countries at the time. So one big one, all men and women over the age of 20 were able to vote. I want to point out that women's suffrage, so the ability to vote here in the United States, didn't happen until like the 50s, right? So this was huge. Huge. Very, very woke. German citizens were guaranteed freedom of speech and religion, which I guess is kind of par for the course for like a democracy, but still, that wasn't a thing in the the Prussian Empire. All German citizens were meant to be equal. I say meant to be equal because I think in practice, equality is something you have to work for. It's not something that you sign into a document and just immediately a thing. German citizens would elect the president, so they had free and fair elections, and then the Reichstag, which is what they call the parliament there. So they were able to select their leaders, so to speak. Well, actually, technically, they were voting for parties, and that's how they ended up getting it. But still, they would vote directly for the president. And then the Reichstag made laws, and they appointed the government, and they also appointed the chancellor, and that typically fell in line with how people voted proportionally, because they had a proportional system of government, where if some party got 30% of the vote, then they're going to get 30% of the representation. And therefore, actually what ended up happening is there were so many fucking parties that nobody ever got a majority. So what would happen, and this is kind of the positive point out of it, is that those parties would have to cooperate with one another in coalitions. So on paper, it sounds really great, but in practice, there were some problems there. So I can talk about the negative aspects of the Weimar Republic, and I'll start with that one. The parliament, as I said, was elected through this system of proportional representation. And so the German citizens would vote for a party. Let's say they voted for the SDP, rather than a specific candidate. Like, I'm not voting for, fucking AOC. I'm voting for Democrats, as an example, right? And what happened is that there was just a ton of these smaller parties, and no party ended up getting a majority. So they would form these coalitions, which on paper sounds like a good thing, right? Everybody has to cooperate with one another. There's no, not like here in the United States today where there's only really two parties that you can choose from and they both suck. It's like you can, they all have to get along and make compromises and things like that. So on paper, it sounds great. But in practice, what happened was a constant stream of disagreements between all of these parties. And we would have these flip-flop parties where one party would side with, would join a coalition with another party for one particular issue, and then for 5 more issues would be totally against them, and that would hamper their ability to make deals with one another. It was crazy.
So you're saying
so much disagreement.
The party system created a gridlock system.
Absolutely. Right. And it
sounds like a
I'd
positive
argue
to me.
Probably I mean, I'd argue it was probably worse than our gridlock, and we only have 2 parties. So imagine if we had 10, and none of them can agree on fucking anything.
The gridlock between the Republican and the Democrats is the only thing that keeps us from not falling off a cliff. The more they cooperate, the more evil the policies they create.
Right, but also, when we're talking about an extreme, government here, because during this time when they had this gridlock, they're also experiencing hyperinflation and hyper, poverty and hyper everything, right? So you kind of need somebody to do something, right? They can't just be fucking, yelling at each other all the time and not getting anything done, right? Because that's going to cause a lot of civil unrest, right? And there was a lot of civil unrest as a result, right? Nothing was happening. Nothing was getting done in the early part of the Weimar Republic. And, I got to talk about this one. There was this article in their constitution called Article 48, and it stated that, and this is creepy because it feels like some shit that we've had. It stated that in an emergency, the president can take control of Germany and issue laws and decrees by executive action, right? And, much like, say, like the War Powers Act or something like that here, the quote, the emergency wasn't well defined, right? So obviously it left it wide open for abuse, and eventually they did start abusing that, and they kind of had to use this law a lot because of all of the disagreements. Like nobody was getting anything done. And meanwhile, the German economy is tanking. People are rioting. Like there's like separatist movements. There's so much shit was happening that somebody had to do something, and that tended to be the president, who would invoke Article 48 and like say, nope, we're going to do this. And sometimes it was good, but most of the time it was bad, because obviously it would allow for dictatorships to develop. And, flash forward, spoiler alert, guess who ends up being the chancellor, and eventually also the president, who then named himself the Führer and used
Angela Merkel.
No, which by the way, actually, they're voting next month. Pretty concerned. Hater or lover, Merkel has been a center point for Europe for a while.
I have a real
very interesting.
I have a real right wing friend, like a real like right wing friend, and he says that Angela Merkel is the reincarnation of Hitler. He calls her the reincarnation of Hitler, and that's her ultimate goal.
No,
it's
she's
very
not.
funny.
No, not even close.
I think it's very funny.
All right,
It's
so
like, she's Hitler. I'm telling you, she's the reincarnation of Hitler. Like
can we make like a concerted?
Like she wants to bring
like
all these Arabs in, and she wants to use them to create. Like I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
None of that makes sense. Can we also make a concerted effort to please ask everyone to stop using Hitler like he's Hitler or she's Hitler or that's Hitler?
No. He
like,
wasn't saying that she's like Hitler. He was saying
he said
that she is the reincarnation of Hitler. Like she is Hitler.
That's
like
nonsense.
Hitler.
That is fucking nonsense.
I don't. It's funny.
I'd prefer that she say that she was a lizard person, because I'd buy that more than I'd buy she's the reincarnation of Hitler. 100%. All right. So I talked about good things and bad things, real cursory stuff. So when I was doing the research here, and Henry, thank you so much for sending over so many really awesome kind of economically leaning like reviews of the Weimar Republic, because it definitely helped me to to understand there was a lot of problems in the Weimar Republic, but definitely inflation was this big beast that it was such a extreme focus, and it detracted so much, and it made the people lose confidence in this new government in the post-war period. So it was interesting to read this from a libertarian perspective. I ended up taking away a lot of things and agreeing with a lot of the logic, especially around how government intervention in the economic system causes more harm than good. And when reviewing it from the lens of the late World War I period and the early Weimar Republic period, I totally agree.
One of the big debates on this subject is, did the welfare program cause the hyperinflation, or was the Treaty of Versailles the primary reason that caused it? And I'm not really qualified to answer that question, but I see both cases. So I want to read this, and this is from the book The Age of Inflation. It's by an Austrian economist, Hans Sinholz. Throughout the period of the inflation, the most popular explanation of the monetary depreciation laid the blame on an unfavorable balance of payments, which in turn was blamed on the payment of reparation and other burdens imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. To most German writers and politicians, the government deficits and the paper inflation were not the causes but the consequences of the external depreciation of the mark. The wide popularity of this explanation, which charged the victorious Allies with full responsibility for the German disaster, bore ominous implications for the future. Its simplicity made it appealing to the masses of economically ignorant people whose chauvinism and nationalism always make the idea of foreign intrigue and conspiracy so palatable. The intellectual and political leaders who actively propagated the doctrine were sowing the seeds for the whirlwind they reaped a decade later. During those baleful years, Germany actually procured graciously from abroad large quantities of raw materials and foodstuffs. According to various authoritative estimates, foreign individuals and banks bought at least 60 billion paper marks, which the Reichsbank had floated abroad at an average price of 1/4 gold mark for a paper mark. The depreciation of the mark to 1/trillionth of its earlier value repudiated these foreign claims to German goods. Thus, foreigners suffered losses of 15 billion gold marks, or some 3.5 billion US dollars, which was 8 times more than Germany had paid in foreign exchange on account of reparations. But even if it had been true that excessive burdens had been thrust on Germany by the Allies, there is no need for any monetary depreciation. Both phenomena are entirely independent. If excessive burdens are placed on a government, whether they be foreign or domestic, that government must raise taxes or borrow some funds or curtail other expenditures. Excessive reparation payments may necessitate greater higher taxes on the populace, or large loans that reduce the supply of savings for industry and commerce, or painful cuts in government service and employment. The standards of living of the people thus burdened will probably be depressed unless the reduction of bureaucracy should release new productive energy. But the value of money is not affected by the reparation burden unless economic productivity is impaired by the fundraising. Once government has achieved the necessary budgetary surplus, the payment of reparation is a simple matter of exchange. The Treasury buys the necessary gold or foreign exchange from a central bank and delivers it to the recipient government. The loss of gold or foreign exchange then necessitates a corresponding reduction of central bank money, which in turn tends to depress goods prices. Lower goods prices encourage more exports while they discourage imports. That is generate what is commonly called a favorable balance of payments, or new influx of gold and foreign exchange. In short, there could be no shortage of gold or foreign exchange as long as the central bank refrains from inflation and monetary depreciation. The German monetary authorities flatly denied this economic reasoning. Instead, they preferred to lament about the excessive burdens thrust onto Germany and the unfavorable balance of payments generated thereby. In 1923, they added yet another factor, the French occupation of the Ruhr district. So I want to stop right there.
Let's talk about that for a second.
I want to talk about the French occupation of the Ruhr, because this is one of the big rallying calls of a lot of German writers. The annexation of territory in Germany was, to me, one of the primary causes why there was this really strong national fervor that led to someone like Adolf Hitler being elected. So let's talk about this occupation. So in May of 1921, the Allies demanded Germany transfer 4 billion marks annually, and they had to make additional payments as their economy grew. And these demands amounted to be about half of the total German tax revenue. And if they didn't comply, or if the conditions were not met, the Allies threatened to occupy the Ruhr Valley. And the Ruhr Valley was a very heavily industrialized part of Western Germany. So the Allies, the Allied governments, they imposed high duties on its exports, making it hard for Germany to run surplus on external trade. But since the Reichstag refused to hike taxes, and they didn't do this by the determined date, the Allies they annexed Upper Silesia in Poland and this is one of those places that was like half German, half Polish. It was I think it probably was more Polish than German. It was like 60% Polish, 40% German, but that's where you get Germans living outside of the borders. And as a protest to these stiff terms, Germany suspended all the payments in June of 1922, and by early 1923, it failed to make deliveries of coal as payments. So, in January of 1923,
right, because they were able to give raw goods as well as money for the reparations, right? They took the value of those things as well.
Well, what happens is that in response for Germany missing those coal payments, France and Belgium occupy the Ruhr. And you get like a lot of weird,
Right.
a lot of interesting pictures from this period as well. There's a picture of like a black African soldier confronting a German citizen. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture. He's a soldier from the colony. I'm not sure where he's from, but he's a soldier from, either a Belgian or a French colony. And, it's like one of those pictures are like, oh, this is why the Germans became so racist. I think it's a lot more complex than that, but it's a famous picture. If you look it up, Google it. It's interesting. But the protest to these stiff terms was that the German workers, I guess they passively resisted this. They went on strike to prevent France from essentially looting the region's coal and steel reserves. And, without coal, German railroads couldn't run. And without railroads, the German economy couldn't run. So they had to start importing coal.
That's right.
So
right.
After the government deficit widened, the money stock soared. And, to go back to, these political assassination, Walter Rathenau, who was a foreign minister, who was, he signed papers. He basically signed a treaty that gave up Germany's occupied land in France. And I think there was something around 400 political assassinations at that time.
I mean, there's so many of them. There were hundreds of them. Actually, I read an interesting bit about kind of the makeup of the political assassinations, and there was this guy, E.J. Gumbel. He was a German mathematician and statistician. He came from a prominent Jewish family in Württemberg. But that's kind of just some backstory on him. The important point on here, as far as the political assassinations go, was that his friend was the victim of a political murder by a Nazi brown shirt in the early 1920s. And how that story shaked out was that when they went to court, and this Nazi was put on trial, the judge totally ignored the evidence against him, and he was basically just let off, which obviously pissed off this guy, EJ. Gumbel was obviously mad about it, and he was an intellectual type and a mathematician and a statistician, so he starts documenting a bunch of these political murders and published what he learned in a book, and the book is called 4 Years of Political Murder, and he released that in 1922. But in that book, he calculated that domestic terrorists, just generally speaking, committed about 454 political murders in the early years of the Weimar Republic. But one interesting thing that he found was that while judges were very harsh in their treatment of a small number of left-wing, and by the way, when I say left-wing here, I mean their left-wing, like communists, assailants, in these terrorist attacks, the same judges were kind of sympathetic for right-wing terrorist violence. And again, I don't mean like our right wing, I mean like Nazis. It might be the same thing. Anyway, so this book and this like information ended up getting him on the Nazi shit list when they took power. So he ended up making his way to the U.S. and ended up teaching in Columbia. But what was interesting about that was that there was a very broad, political climate of assassinations from both radical sides. But because a lot of these judges were, holdovers from the Prussian Empire, they were more, I want to say conservative. I want to say they were more right-wing, more right-leaning. And so they were more apt to follow up with left-wing terrorism than they were with right-wing terrorism. And what that causes a bit of an imbalance, right? So, both radical left and radical right wing parties were vying for political capital in the early Weimar period. But the communists basically didn't get a chance, right? Because their extremist means were curtailed because if they did something crazy like a political assassination, they're going to be put to death in many cases. However, a right-wing extremist doing the same political assassination, committing the same crime, was less likely to die. So it kind of emboldened the right wing on here, and it was just like this crazy imbalance in the left wing versus right wing jurisprudence, which is at least part of why the Nazis were able to take power, because they didn't see the same types of repercussions as the it very well could. If it was the opposite, we might have seen, instead of Hitler, we might have seen a communist revolution in Germany.
And that is justification for what people use for the welfare state there, because the Germans wanted to avoid a Bolshevik revolution, so they thought that if they didn't, subsidize, these labor unions or give special privileges to these labor unions,
then the communists would, right?
There was a lot of benefits that they gave, as far as healthcare benefits, 8-hour work days, things like that. Things that labor unions are fighting for.
We'll talk more about that for sure.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But if they did not give those benefits, then that would lead to an actual revolution. That would lead to a Bolshevik revolution. But what do these political murders result in? Is they result in political turmoil, and political turmoil causes a large-scale exodus of financial assets and capital, which in Germany's case made its domestic price increases go from bad to insane. Germany entered into a full-scale liquidity crisis at that time in 1922, 1923. All that being said, though, I think the hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic is because of the German central banks, or the German central bank. So I have another quote for you from a German economist, Thorsten Pohle. He says, and this leads into how the hyperinflation was eventually ended. From April 1920 to March 1921, the ratio of tax revenues to spending amounted to just 37%. Thereafter, the situation improved somewhat in June 1922. Tax relative to total spending even reached 75%. Then things turned ugly. Toward the end of 1922, Germany was accused of having failed to deliver its reparation payments on time. To back their claim, French and Belgian troops invaded and occupied the Ruhr, the Reich's industrial heartland, at the beginning of January 1923. The German government, under Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, called upon Ruhr workers to resist any orders from the invaders, promising the Reich would keep paying their wages. The Reichsbank began printing up new money by monetizing debt to keep the government liquid for making up tax shortfalls and paying wages, social transfers, and subsidies. For May 1923, on the quantity of the paper mark started spinning out of control. It rose from 8.61 billion in May to 17.34 billion in April, and further to 669 billion in August, reaching 400 quintillion in November of 1923. Wholesale prices skyrocketed to astronomical levels, rising by 1,813% from the end of 1919 to November 1923. At the end of World War I in 1918, you could have bought 500 billion eggs for the same money you would have to spend 5 years later for just one egg. Through November 1920,
500 billion eggs.
500 billion eggs. That's a lot of eggs. Through November 1923, the price of the U.S. dollar in terms of paper mark had risen by 8.9%. The paper market actually sunken to scrap value.
Well, maybe now's the time, a good time for me to jump back to what I was talking about before, about how the inflation ended. And just to kind of bring us back to what I was talking about before, we were discussing this guy, this nice chap, Stresemann, and how he kind of came into power in 24. And the first big thing that Stresemann had to do was to tackle, the problem of inflation, right? So obviously nobody does this alone, right? So we give him credit, but we also want to talk about some other people too. So there's him and his finance minister, Hans Luther. They basically get together and they start making this plan to stop the bleeding. And how they do this is by introducing a new type of currency that's called the Rentenmark, right? Now, unlike the old mark, right, the Papiermark or the paper marks, the value of the Rentenmark was going to be fixed to gold prices, right? So, libertarian's dream here. And the Rentenmark actually was an intermediary currency. They were eventually going to switch over to the Reichsmark afterwards, which was also going to be on the gold standard. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, though. But the point, though, is that they went from this ridiculous print a bunch of money that's worth basically nothing to, all right, let's switch to this thing that has, it's backed by a physical commodity, gold in this case. And what they were doing was inviting a bunch of people to come in and trade their old marks for new marks, right? So wheelbarrows full of them. But it actually started to work in this case. And inflation started slowing drastically because, these new marks, as expected, were not just like, hey, let's just print a bunch of money, because that was the whole problem in the first place. They just kept printing more money. So when they switched over to something that actually had a value, prices started stabilizing. Obviously you'd get I don't remember the exact exchanges, but something extreme, like, 1 trillion marks of the old marks would be like one regular Rentenmark. So it was something like that. People didn't have to take a whole fucking dump truck full of money to go grocery shopping. So that was really good. And at that moment, we really start seeing a kind of decline in this kind of negative period of the Weimar Republic, which is where we start the Golden Age. And to be clear, the Golden Age wasn't gold for everybody, and I want to talk about that for sure. But the Golden Age was a pretty big deal for a lot of people, and definitely for the economy. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So there was the problem of hyperinflation, and we talked about that. And I've already forgotten the name of the guy that you quoted, was also talking about how the reparation problem and the inflation problem weren't, in unison, right? So they weren't connected. They were two separate things, right? And I totally agree with that, because they had to handle both issues separately and individually. It's not like, oh, if I fix the reparation problem, it suddenly fixes the inflation problem, and the reverse isn't true too, right? So just because they fix the inflation problem doesn't get rid of this problem with reparations, right? So the next thing that he had to tackle was that reparations problem. So, the inflation had temporarily stabilized, but they were still paying out, or at least they were defaulting on, the reparations that were basically killing the economy. So first, and this was a very unpopular thing for among a lot of people, but it helped, is that he made commitments to the international community that Germany would make good on their payments. And what this did was it helped to restore kind of foreign relations, right? But obviously it hurt him politically, because those reparations were so bad in, the Germans' eyes. They're like, wait, we're going to go back to fucking paying people again, and this is, of course, in the shadow of like the Ruhr occupation and a bunch of all this other shit where, they're losing territory over not paying, and now we're going to pay again. So it wasn't a very popular thing, but he did it anyway. If I'm not mistaken, actually, I think he, basically used the Article 48 to do that. This is one of those situations where he just kind of took control and did something. But he used that political capital, And at this point, he wasn't the president anymore. He only served for 100 days, but he ended up getting appointed as the foreign minister by the next president. And so Stresemann actually ended up working real closely with the U.S. on renegotiating those reparations. And obviously, he wouldn't have been able to do this if not for all this political capital that he gained from making those commitments that Germany would continue paying for reparations. So Stresemann and the U.S., they start getting real buddy-buddy, and they created the Dawes Plan in 1924. And this plan was actually pretty good for Germany because it actually put a pause on all of the reparations until 1929, right? So the idea was that Germany was still going to pay the full amount that they were supposed to pay, but the idea was that they just kind of needed some time to get back on their feet. You can think of it like you get out of school and you have like student debt or something like that. You get like a little 6-month period or whatever that you don't have to pay, but like if after 6 months you still can't pay because you haven't found a job because it's impossible in some cases, you can also get like a forbearance, right? And they're basically saying like, hey, okay, you don't have to pay right now. You still owe everything, but we give you a little bit more time to get back on your feet. So you can think of it that way. But this massively, massively, massively helped the German government's cash flow problem and its reserves of raw materials. Because if you remember, it wasn't just a cash that they were giving out. They were also giving out things like coal, right? So now they can use their raw materials to help spur on their own economy, right? So you pointed out that, without coal, the German railroads couldn't run, and without German railroads, the economy basically is off. So now Stresemann works with the U.S. to get the Dawes Plan working. Now they don't have to pay anything for a couple of years, and now they can start using that raw materials to start building up their economy, and using some expertise and some engineering know-how from the United States, they actually start building up their industrial sector quite a lot. Here's where I think Stresemann made a huge mistake. Now, the cash flow and the reserves were better in Germany, but the economy still kind of needed a boost. And this is where they turned to the U.S., who happily loaned them a shit ton of money. People all over the world were loaning them money at the time. You pointed that out already. But $25 billion in foreign money between 1924 and 1929 came into Germany. And more than half of this money came from American loans. And most of that money was facilitated by bankers that were acting as an intermediary between the governments. So we're talking about like central bank loans. Basically they were able to use this kind of connection and partnership. So now the United States is obviously investing in Germany, so they don't want them to fail. So they also start giving them financial and industrial expertise to help them. I think this is a mistake for the reason that, you really shouldn't take on debt in order to spur on an economy. And I think this is something that I'm starting to come around on. I think this more libertarian idea, because once they start calling that debt, well, then you're building your house on. It's like building a house of cards, if you will. We'll talk about that in a second. But the temporary result of this was an economic boom. So you start seeing new factories being constructed or converted, and a lot of them are using a whole shit ton of mechanization and assembly line techniques. You can make the argument that this economic boom and this know-how really spurred on and gave Germany largely their foundation. Even today, not long ago, Germany was outproducing fucking China in terms of manufacturing, right? Much smaller country, and a lot of the roots of that kind of German engineering comes from this, right? Comes from this giant economic boom that happened during there. But obviously the negative offshoot is that the Nazis took advantage of it to build up their war machine, right? So they were building up all of these factories and stuff that ended up being converted to like creating fucking Leopard tanks and shit.
Well, let me stop you right there. So here's just an antidote. Yeah. But someone was telling me that they used to work in a machine shop, and the owner of the machine shop was a German guy, and he said that every single owner of all these machine shops were all German guys, and they all were just so meticulous and so like experts at their crafts. And he's like, imagine just a whole society of people like that. And that was Nazi Germany. That's what he explained. Like what he was trying to explain to me. Is like they were just so meticulous, like looking at every single detail. So do you think that?
Well, I mean, he's not. I mean, on the face of it, he's not wrong about that. No,
anecdotal kind of story, first-hand experience.
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong about that. I think.
That's why they were unfortunate Panzer tanks.
Yeah, I mean, what's unfortunate about that is that we that line of argumentation usually starts with saying the Nazis started that, but actually this started well before the Nazis took power, right? This ingenuity came out of the Golden Age in the Weimar Republic. This was something that they co-opted to fuel their war machine, right? But this was intended and originally developed and successfully deployed for the greater good of the people, right? So to spur on the economy, and this was pretty great for them. Then what happened was that after a while, they started paying back France and Belgium and other people their restorations early. And this caused France and Belgium to stop their occupation of the Ruhr and pull out in 25. So now they have a strong industrial sector that was propped up by American investments with American know-how and techniques. And now they just unlocked one of their most profitable regions for manufacturing, which was the Ruhr, which basically attracted more investment from outside, which at the time seemed like a really good idea, but just meant more foreign debt. So just to put this into perspective here, at this point, Germany's recovery was so rapid that it exceeded the recovery of post-World War I of France and Britain. By 29, Germany was producing 33% more than before the war, and Germany had taken the second highest producing industrial nation title, second only to the United States. That's how good they were doing in the Weimar Republic.
The question is, what happened?
Well, I think in order to talk about what happened, we want to talk a little bit about the social programs that were established as well, because it wasn't just all economic. The social programs, admittedly, were good for a lot of people, but were bad for some people. Well, not bad. They just weren't as good for other people. And this will become a linchpin for its demise, I think. And also, on the economic front, there's all that foreign debt that they were taking on. I'm definitely going to talk about that in a second. But let's talk about social programs, because these are some pretty good things in the Golden Age. So they had this unemployment insurance law that was passed in 27, which basically required workers and their employees to make contributions to, an unemployment program. And that was pretty beneficial because at the time, even though they were booming, there was still a whole lot of unemployed. So then that gave them kind of a floor to stand on, so to speak. So it helped out a lot of people that were out of work. It also didn't help out a lot of people. I'll talk about that in a moment. But a couple of other kind of welfare-ish stuff that they were doing was they provided benefits and assistance to war veterans, to wives and dependents of the war who died, to single mothers, to the disabled. So they're really helping out the folks that were really having some trouble in Germany, which is a very woke thing. It's very, very progressive, very liberal. Take it or leave it.
It was very good for a lot of people. Also, they tried to fix the housing crisis because there was a massive housing crisis. They had this thing called Article 155 of the Weimar Constitution, which it reads, it says that the state must strive to secure healthy housing to all German families, especially those with many children. So this was in their constitution. So they worked on building a shit ton of new homes. So between 24 and 31, they built 2 million new homes, and about 200,000 more were either renovated or expanded. So by 28, homelessness had been reduced by 60%, more than 60% actually. So that's huge. They were tackling homelessness. California can learn a thing or two about that. So at this point, around 1924, unemployment was about 4%, and that was after like this giant increase in industry and manufacturing jobs came. There was a huge decline in unemployment. So by 29, only 1.4 million people out of 65 million people were without a job. So those they did good on the unemployment front by creating new jobs. They also, as I mentioned before, they stabilized the currency. That created that industrial boom. But something that was really positive about that stabilization of currency was that the quote real value of wages increased. And what I mean by real value of wages, I don't necessarily mean that they got paid more. It means that the buying power of the money that you received was higher. And that increased by 9% in 1928, and it rose to 12% more afterwards. So actually, compared to the rest of Europe, in terms of buying power, real wages, Germany's industrial workforce was the best paid in Europe. So they were, if you were working in a fucking factory, you were doing well for yourself. And there were so many people that were totally without a job that ended up, going into the industrial workplace, and they, pulled themselves out of poverty as a result. I also want to talk a little bit about women. Women dominated the Weimar electorate. So out of a total population of 60 million Germans, there were 2 million young men and women between the ages of 18 and 34 who died, and another 2 million that had been so fucked up, like either physically or mentally, that they couldn't really, they weren't, it was like 4 million people that weren't going to be participating in governance. And so prior to this, women weren't allowed in any political organizations, in like pre-World War I, but they definitely took up the mantle during the Weimar Republic. And in those years, women voted in huge numbers and supported like the Weimar Republic, because obviously they had granted them the ability to vote. So they're, returning the favor, so to speak. But unfortunately, by the end of the Weimar Republic, women started leaving those political parties that were supporting the Weimar Republic, so much so that from 1930 to 1932, so this is already in the late hours of the Weimar Republic, women were the fastest growing group who supported the Nazi Party.
See what happened when you let women vote?
I don't like that. I don't like that.
It was a great age for women. They were the base of Hitler, but it was a great age for women's rights.
I mean,
but they were the base for Hitler.
I think just like that's probably there are more reasons that are independent of gender that why people voted and supported the Nazi Party. But I want to talk about why, because that's kind of important, because you asked like what happened, right? This what felt like a fucking miracle, an economic miracle, didn't actually benefit everyone equally. And the people who were the hardest hit were the middle class. So the middle class in the Weimar Republic, they lost all of their wealth, all of their savings, basically, due to the hyperinflation in 1923. So like if you were a regular middle class person and you had some money in the bank, hyperinflation basically eviscerated your buying power, and it was just gone, right? So, those middle class people, I'm talking about like managers, bankers, bureaucrats, clerks, other like white collar professionals. They didn't come into this golden age with like, with like a leg up. They also failed to benefit from a lot of the social programs. So a lot of the white collar workers didn't get the same welfare benefits as people that were in the industrial sector. And so while generally I did say that unemployment fell a lot, it actually remained really high among white collar professionals. I mean, I guess the argument there could be made like, all right, well, why don't you just get a industrial job then? That's kind of like the counter argument there. But when you've been trained and you've been working all your life in a white collar job to kind of move to an industrial job, for lack of a better word, feels to you like a regression, even if it's affecting your income. But a lot of these unemployed white collar workers, for one reason or another, didn't actually qualify for those same unemployment benefits that a lot of other people were getting. So they were pretty sour about that, admittedly. So that makes sense. And this kind of created an atmosphere in the Weimar Republic among the middle classes that the government was favoring the working classes, the industrial classes, over the middle classes. They called it a form of class warfare to impose, quote, socialism by stealth, which is something that a lot of our politicians on the right specifically, like to say a lot. But this was like for realsies, socialism by stealth. And then the last kind of shitty part about being middle class in Weimar Republic was that there was no major party that represented them. So, people, the workers' classes, like they were represented by folks like the SDP or the Communist Party, the KDP, and the folks on the right were supported by the National Socialists. So when these middle class people, they're like, well, hey, we're getting a shit end of the stick. Who's going to help us? Who's going to help us fix our problems? They ended up turning to the National Socialists because the National Socialists were able to tap into this middle class resentment that they're not getting a fair shake. And I think this kind of brings us to the overall question of why the Weimar Republic ended, and why the Nazis were able to take power, and a number of things. And you can look at it from a social and a political perspective, and you can look at it from an economic perspective. Definitely want to talk about the economics, but first social stuff. There were two real types of Weimar politics. There was this, very limited, very pragmatic approach that was coming out of the center. And then there was this radical change movement. And that was split between left and right. So there was two radical change movements, but generally speaking, we can kind of group them together. So the parties that supported the Weimar Republic initially, like the Social Democrats or the Democratic Party or the Center Party, they were promising things like higher wages, shorter working hours, lower taxes, better schools, so on and so forth, healthcare, you name it. Like, these are the things that they were promising to do. But at the same time, the folks that were on the extreme left and right were promising the same thing. They were promising, the communists and the Nazis were saying the same shit. They're like, oh, we'll give you higher wages and shorter working hours and lower taxes and better schools and stuff like that. So that sounds super appealing to a lot of people who were disillusioned by how things were going post World War I. I mean, think about it this way. All of the political movements of the day were promising the same thing, to increase the standard of living for the people. And, the Republic had a rough start, right? They had this, they had their reputation tarnished by a lot of things, including hyperinflation, abject poverty, resentment towards reparations, right? So that's where they started.
The loss of land.
The loss of land, that's a great one, right? So that's the place that the Weimar Republic started from. So they had a tarnished reputation from the start. And even though they were doing a really good job at turning that around, they always had that black mark on their record. And so even though we were showing strength and stability in this golden age, it was propped up by foreign investments, right? It wasn't like organic in that respect. And when the Great Depression hit, right, in the United States, well, shit, there goes all the money. They start recalling all that debt, and basically the repercussions of that was felt very strongly in the Weimar Republic as well. So there's this economic implosion that came as a result of your entire economy being propped up by the United States, who themselves are having a hard time. So if you take all that together, normal people started looking at like these radical fringe politics, and they were kind of like interested. They were like, all right, well, let's do a change, right? These guys are all saying the same shit, but these other guys say that they can do the same thing and they're different, right? So they wanted to change it up. After all, I mean, they tried a republic and it didn't work out so well, at least not in the beginning, right? And it didn't work out when the Great Depression hit and, basically crumbled all of their gains. And so, we already talked about how the Germans in general were crushing the communists, right? And they didn't want a Bolshevik revolution in Germany, so they didn't really have the ability to kind of come up and take the power, because even though they tried very hard, there was a lot of forces that were keeping them at bay. But there were no forces, as I pointed out, or at least there were fewer forces that were putting down the far right in Weimar Germany. As I mentioned before, those judges were not doling out the same punishments to right-wing terrorists as they were to left-wing terrorists. And there weren't institutionalized policies to put down communist revolutions in the same way that there weren't like any, let's put down Nazis, policies. There just wasn't any of them. So it created a perfect storm of conditions by which the Nazi Party and by extension, of course, Adolf Hitler to take power. And remember Article 48? I was talking about this before, and it was the ability for the president to basically override the Reichstag, the parliament, and just issue decrees from the bully pulpit, so to speak. Hitler had been bugging, and I'm forgetting his name right now, which sucks. There was a president who was a former military general. It was a conservative guy, but not quite super far right. And he had been ignoring the Nazi Party and specifically Hitler. He had been asking, like, I want to be, chancellor. Make me chancellor. Make me chancellor. And eventually, due to the political climate that I just described in great detail, eventually he's like, all right, fine, fuck it. You can be chancellor, right? A little while later, that president dies, and Hitler was the chancellor, so he also assumed the presidentship. And then as soon as he did that, he invoked Article 48 and said, all right, fuck it. We're now, the Third Reich. That's it. End of story.
I guess, if you find a bunch of embittered people who feel like they've been humiliated, you throw them a nice little uniform and kind of promise them not just pride but dignity. It's a pretty appealing message for a lot of people.
Right. I mean, they were conditions for radicalism on both sides, but as we described, one side didn't have quite as many restrictions or limitations or even negative repercussions for wrongdoing as the other side. So it was pretty easy, frankly, for them to take over. So there was a lot of huge mistakes that the Weimar Republic made, but in context, there was also a lot of really great things that they were doing too. It just didn't shake out the way that they wanted it to, you know?
Well, I'll say so. Well, I'll say so. Yeah. Well, definitely, I don't think any of it needed to happen. I don't think World War II had to happen. Some people say it was inevitable. I think it definitely didn't have to happen. All right, before we wrap this show up, we need to talk about Afghanistan. I know this is kind of a huge, like a really non-subtle segue, but we were talking about Afghanistan a couple of days ago about how the government in Kabul is falling, and I'm sure if you're listening, this is being recorded on Friday, so who knows what the hell is going to happen by the time this episode is released. But the last news report I checked, the Taliban have seized control of four more provincial capitals and cemented its control of the strategic south. And right now, in only 8 days, the Taliban took control of 16 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces and conquered 18 of its provincial capitals. And this is a Afghan army forces has opened a door for the Taliban siege of Kabul, as the insurgents now firmly control the majority of Afghanistan cities and districts, including the strategically and culturally significant Kandahar. I'm reading this from the Long Wars Journal, by the way, by Bill Ruggiero. With control of Ghazni and Logar provinces and an uptick in fighting in the east, the road to Kabul is now open. So they took Kandahar, which is the second biggest city and kind of like the historical capital of the Pashtuns. The U.S. is deploying troops to help evacuate people who work in the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan. The country is collapsing quicker than we even anticipated.
Yep.
I think we gave it I thought it was going to be 90 days, not
I thought it was going to be a few months. Mm-hmm.
And that's how fast the Afghan government is crumbling. And I didn't even think I don't think if they take Kabul, that will be something. But right now the Taliban control about 65% of the country. That's a very low conservative estimate. Probably much higher. I feel like the U.S. would intervene a little bit more if they went for Kabul. But
I don't think it's a question of if they take Kabul. I think it's just a question of when.
Kabul's a big population center, but if they take Kabul, there's a theory that
they took Kandahar,
but Kandahar, it's more Pashtuns are there. Easier. It's it's the historical home of the Pashtuns.
No, I feel that, but it's not like they just open the doors and say, "Hey, come in." You know what I mean?
Well, there's a warlord who lives in Kabul named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is this guy's been around forever. I think he's got to be in his 80s now, and he's a Pashtun warlord, but he's not Taliban, and he is in Kabul, and he used to be allied with the Taliban, but he switched sides to the Afghan government. But some theorize that he might be a Trojan horse, so he might call his militiamen to do kind of like what's the order in Star Wars, Order 67 or whatever, Executive Order 67.
Like
when they kill the Jedi, some shit like that. That's what's in Scott Horton's book, so I'm just repeating what he says. But it's crazy right there. Wanted to bring that up before we concluded today's episode, just because we did an episode on the fall of the Afghan government a couple of weeks ago. Before we wrap this one up, is there anything that you would like to add, Danny?
Nope. I think we're good.
All right. Well, thanks again for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you want to support the show, number one way to do that is to rate and review the podcast if you're listening on your Apple device. So rate and review the podcast. If you are on Apple, just go to the 5-star, rate and review 5-star. Very helpful for our growth. And then you can also support us on Patreon at brohistory-patreon. I guess that's it, right?
Yeah.
All right.
That's all.
All right. We will see you next week. Peace.
Peace.